Okay, today is October 15th, 2007. We're here at the Circle Cinema, and this evening we're pleased to have Mr. John Sultan of Tulsa. Was in the Navy and a lieutenant commander. And Mr. Sultan, thank you for joining us today. And I just asked if you would tell us your story in your words.
Do the best you can.
Okay, great.
I was born September 22nd, 1921. I grew up on a farm outside Okmulgee County. And from the time my memory began, that's where I participated. I graduated from a small country school, Preston High School, and went on to a junior college, Northern Oklahoma Junior College at Tonkawa, Oklahoma. And I was in my third semester when Pearl Harbor occurred. As I remember, happened on a Sunday afternoon. I was lying on my bunk trying to study a little bit and listen to a baseball game, and I wasn't very successful at either, I guess. But it happened, and I was near the end of the semester, so I went ahead and finished my term, which made me a 3-semester total of college when Pearl Harbor occurred. So after finishing that semester, I went home. My folks still lived on the farm, and I went home and prepared to be inducted or to enlist. At first I was desired and attempted to join the Navy, and learned that the Navy requirements to enter flight school as a flight cadet were more stringent than I was able to fulfill, at least at that time. They required 2 years of college completed, and I had only had the 3 semesters. So I took what I thought was an alternative. The Air Force friends I have won't appreciate when I say I took second choice, but I did. At least I attempted to. I was going to join the Air Force, and because their requirements had been lowered to the point where I could fulfill them with no problem. As I was walking down the hall with my papers and my mother's approval all signed and written, I passed the Navy recruiting office. Kind of slowed down to look at the pictures they had showing and the windows, and there was a huge-bodied Navy chief standing in the doorway with stripes up to his elbows. He must have been at least 35 years in service. He says, "Come in here, boy. The Navy needs you." And I said, "Sir, they had your choice. You won't accept me." He said, "Well, let's come on in. Let's talk about this." Well, about 2.5 hours later, I was signed up and a member of the Navy. I was about to be. And I asked his guidance. They asked the his commander, who was preparing to swear me in the Navy, what's going to happen to me now? How come yesterday I wasn't qualified to meet your Navy requirements, but today you're about to swear me in? And he said, well, you need to understand that things are in a state of flux, and things that happen today won't necessarily happen tomorrow in the same order. So it'll work out. Believe me, it'll work out. You'll be judged by your accomplishments. How you handle it, you'll undergo a lot of tests. You will be under constant observance, and this in one respect will be kind of a trial, and you think more of tribulations than you were anything else, probably, but it won't be any more difficult than it will the people who've got 3 or 4 years of college now. So in the event you fail and don't stack up to what we consider our requirements, and they are rigid, then you will be transferred into the branch of the Navy and become a seaman second, a trainee, and you no longer receive pilot training. So we agreed that was satisfactory, and he swore me in, and 2 weeks later I was in active duty in Dallas Naval Air Station. The first month at Dallas, we had nothing but rigid ground school, and rigid also because half the day was spent marching with rifles in Dallas summertime, which wasn't the most pleasant in moving through. But anyhow, after 4 weeks of nothing but ground school, we did start flying, and we had half a day on training during ground school, and a half day on the flight line, which consisted normally of at least 1 hour of actual flight control with an instructor. And after approximately 8.5 hours of flight training with an instructor, that was a normal procedure to solo, and that of course was a great thrill and anticipation of having made a major step forward in our training, and we were pretty proud of ourselves, but not near as proud as we became later. After 3 months at Dallas, we were transferred to Corpus Christi and became officially naval cadets in flight, undergoing flight training. We went various naval air stations around Dallas, around Corpus Christi itself, and we trained in various and sundry type of aircraft, all single engine at that point in time, and propeller driven, of course. At that time, that's all there were. From there, I can name some of these little airstrips if you care for me to. Robb Field was one. We flew what we termed the Yellow Peril there, the N2S single engine. This was all as pilots. We left the instructors behind. The instructors were flying their own planes from then on, and we were flying the same type of aircraft in various phases of gunnery and dive bombing and strafing and navigation. Carrier pilots, we all had to be our own navigator, and so from there we successfully passed everything that was asked of us so far, and went on to graduated and became ensigns, which was a one stripe on the Navy coat.
How soon after that were you deployed? Were you shipped overseas?
Our first assignment as ensigns and pilots was to yet another training base at Opelika, Florida, which was combat type airplanes. The ones that we flew as fighter pilots were termed a Brewster Buffalo. Now, Brewster Buffaloes were being phased out of the Navy at that time, and I think we were among the last group that flew those. They were a honey of an airplane. The only problem was the doggone thing would fly sideways just as easy as it would. The only time you really flew the doggone thing straight was mostly when the needle and ball crossed itself. As you change, you could tell you're flying sideways by the attitude of the plane and the way you felt. So you kick the rudder and it wouldn't fly straight, it'd just go sideways in the opposite direction. This is a funny thing, and it gets a lot of laughs when old-time pilots hear you say that, because they know that an airplane doesn't really fly. If you leave it alone, it'll just about fly itself. Well, this one didn't, and that's one reason it flew out. I had to say one other thing that I found kind of humorous, and all pilots that flew it agreed with me. It was the only plane, to my knowledge, that's still only plane that was built with came from the factory with a pair of wire cutters. The wire cutters had a little bracket there on the panel, instrument panel, and when you came into land, if the doggone landing gear wouldn't come down, you took that pair of pliers and cut the cable so it would fall of its own accord. This is a true story. I swear to it. I've got a few living buddies who will help me. But thinking back, it's still laughable. From Opelika, Florida, we were sent to Glenview, Illinois, Glenview Naval Air Station, and right outside of Chicago. And by then it had gotten to late March. It's the only time I flew my winter gear, in all my time in the Navy. One time I flew my Navy gear, and it was so cold. We were there to make carrier landings. They had a training ship on the Great Lakes, and in order to qualify as a carrier pilot, you had to make 8 carrier landings, and there were 8 of us in the flight, and it was so cold because we had to fly with our windows open, and the reason we had to was simply because the landing equipment consisted of a rope, Navy lingo, a line that came out of, you're sitting here like similar, and with the throttle and what should have been our landing gear, but we hadn't caught up in manufacturing and to the point where we had equipment ready to do that. So this rope line went out the window, back down the fuselage, and you raised and lowered your hook by that line manually. And the doggone thing, well, that's what I said. We were flying with the window open, and it was cold as the dickens, and we were all, I learned later, just shaking literally in our boots because the temperature, it was near freezing. And when you came around and got cut and landed, the flight deck officer would have to come up and in my case he had to slap my hand off the throttle because I'd gone forward with the hook stopping the forward movement, and I guess most of us did the same thing with our first carrier landing, but we landed, and he had to chop the throttle for us because we weren't smart enough yet. And the next 7 landings, well, we progressed a little bit, but we all ended up making 8 carrier landings. It wasn't that difficult. From there, in fact, we were only there at that air station for 3 days. It took 1 day to get there, and 1 day to check out, and 1 day to make the landings, and we were given a 15-day leave and transferred to San Diego. From there, we had another transfer to Alameda, California, where we joined our squadron. Our squadron's number was VC-42, and that was the V was for fighter planes. The C was for composite. Our squadron was a composite squadron, different from the dive bomber squadron, the torpedo squadrons, in that we had 2 types of airplanes. The other planes generally would have 1 type. The torpedo squadrons had that, and we trained then for 3 months, went aboard the aircraft carrier USS Guadalcanal, That was what we called a baby flat top. And we went from San Diego. We had an interval in Alameda, California, San Diego, went aboard the USS Guadalcanal in San Diego, went around through the canal, did anti-submarine duty, making at least one 4.5 hour flight patrol every day, and of course one carrier landing to get back aboard. Went in after about 3 months of that. We went to Norfolk, Virginia, and we were a little bit successful in our hunt. We were known as a hunter-killer group, our official designation. We were not the only one who had that kind of assignment. Our squadron, our task force, consisted of a small carrier in the center and a curvature, a flotilla of 5 destroyer escorts ahead of us in whatever direction we were going, and a semicircle to the extent that they gave us protection wherever we were, unless they could come up behind us, and we did have a better speed than they do. So we did that, and we made at least 4 cruises. We termed them cruises. We would go out, and the length of our cruise was determined strictly by the aircraft availability. We had approximately, if I remember correctly, I think we had 36 total airplanes, and we all flew our own plane. The make of our plane we changed daily, perhaps due to spotting on the deck, but we would make those sorties, and the weather would be so bad, sometimes the planes would be so badly damaged on landing, we just kick them over the side. Consequently, 35 or 40 planes didn't last very long. So sometimes a cruise might not last over 3 or 4 months, but it was somewhat effective, and we had help from the British. The British made a lot of contributions to anti-submarine warfare. We learned to give them a lot of credit. They developed radar, which I find a lot of people are unaware of, and it was we did this for a little over 2 years, 2.5 years perhaps. Took another submarine to back to the Shamrock Bay. We went back to, incidentally, each cruise we went on a different aircraft carrier, so we never really got to know the ship's crew, because it's kind of congested. And went to Pearl Harbor, back through the canal, of course, to get from East Coast to West Coast, and Pearl Harbor, and were assigned to the USS Corregidor, and went out and did the same thing in the Pacific, in the far west Pacific, for about 12 months. And we were in a typhoon, which I know you read about. You didn't know it, but we were in that typhoon for 70 hours, and sprung a leak. Well, it wasn't a serious leak, but it put it out of commission. So we went back to Pearl Harbor, and the ship was labeled unseaworthy, and so we got to come home just about a couple of weeks before the war ended. Stayed in the Navy then, of course, until it was my turn to be discharged.